From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Erick Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dallas Peterson talks with us about an integrated approach to controlling pigweeds in our row crop production. That's the subject of a new online publication out of K-State. He'll look at the escalating problem of pigweed control and how using a combination of cultural, mechanical, and chemical practices can be advantageous. Then K-State's Erick DeWolf on widespread problems with head blight disease in Kansas wheat as harvest time approaches. He'll offer input on harvesting and managing blight-infested wheat to limit the discounts at the elevator. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee, this week talking about managing woodlands as high-quality habitat for wildlife. All that here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for listening in to another Agriculture Today. K-State Research and Extension has just put out new information for you crop producers on combating what we've come to know as the pigweed species in our crop production, a couple of those in particular, which have been formidable in recent years. Dallas Peterson joins us once more. He's a weed management specialist, and this new resource is a publication on integrated pigweed management. Just how severe pigweeds have become as a weed issue in our crop production here in Kansas. They have really asserted themselves in recent years, have they not, Dallas?
Well, they certainly have. And we've always had pigweeds. You know, the Amaranthus species, which is what we often refer to commonly as the pigweeds, been around. They're native to this area. We've always had an abundance of them. But for the most part, it seemed like they were relatively easy to control until the last 20 to 30 years. And they become more and more problematic through that time, primarily because of the development of herbicide resistance. Water hemp and Palmer amaranth in particular seem to have a real propensity to develop herbicide resistance. And when we don't control them, especially with the Palmer amaranth, it grows so rapidly and is so competitive that it really eats our lunch if we can't control it. And it's a very prolific seed producer, and if it gets away from us, again, then it becomes even that much more difficult to manage just because of the pure numbers game.
And this is hardly an isolated situation. We find these problems virtually throughout the state, or a fair part of it?
Yeah, throughout the state, and really throughout most of, the Midwest and the soybean and corn, cotton growing areas, actually. Palmer amaranth's pretty much common throughout most of the state, maybe except for parts of southeast Kansas. We don't see a lot of Palmer amaranth, maybe even into some of the northeastern part of the state, but it's fairly common throughout. Water hemp is most common in the eastern half of the state. And these two pigweed species are unique in that they're dioecious species. That means they have male and female plants. They don't self-pollinate. They have to cross-pollinate. And so that means that we get an exchange of genes. That's why maybe they're so adaptable to whatever we throw at them. They soon adapt and are able to avoid control or whatever. And they can even hybridize among the different pigweed species. So again, that results in a broad genetic diversity that gives them that ability, it seems like, to develop herbicide resistance.
Thus, the impetus behind the idea of integrated pigweed management. Define that, if you will.
Well, really, it's a pulling together of all the different methods of control that we might try to utilize to manage weeds together and not rely just on one or two. And clearly, again, in the last 40 or 50 years, we've become very reliant on herbicides for weed control, and especially as we shifted to no-till. really one of the primary reasons that we tilled the ground was to control weeds. Now, we also did it to prepare a seed bed when we didn't have very good planting equipment. But again, weed control was still a primary reason that we did tillage. So as we shifted to no-till, we became more reliant on herbicides. In fact, maybe too reliant on herbicides. Maybe when we find the most effective herbicide, we just rely on one herbicide. And we had that, obviously, with glyphosate through the years. And so, again, the weed populations, they adjust. Now we have not just glyphosate-resistant palmer amaranth and water hemp, but those species are resistant to 4 or 5 different classes of herbicides. And so, again, that makes it much more of a challenge.
So you're looking at multiple practices here as part of this management approach: crop rotation, row spacing, that is the thickness of the crop itself, cover crops, a whole slew of alternatives to put into the pot, so to say.
Yeah, it's really kind of going back to the basics and combining those things together to try to effectively manage the weeds. Keep that seed bank low. Don't let it get away from us, and diversify things as much as we can. Because when we develop resistance, it's because of lack of diversity in most cases. Maybe lack of good crop rotation, lack of herbicide diversity. Again, eliminating tillage, if you will, and no-till, so that we are just, again, relying on, in many cases, just 1 or 2 herbicides. And so we want to pull all of those things together, think about that as a system and a way to manage those weeds rather than control the weeds.
Interesting, and it's brought out in this new publication. We've often visited about, as you mentioned earlier, Dallas, the herbicide resistance phenomenon that we've seen in pigweeds. Weeds can also develop a resistance, if you will, to cultural practices or mechanical control practices, maybe over a longer period of time, but that can be an element to this, you say.
Oh, absolutely it can. And again, we don't think about that commonly. But for example, if you go out and mow certain weeds through time, they will develop more of a prostrate growth habit. And they'll still produce seed. And so those plants that are more likely to grow, close to the ground are the ones that survive and reproduce. And so, again, over time, you shift that population to one that has more of a prostrate growth habit. And so you do see those sort of practices impacting and shifting the populations or the biotypes within a species. And it really doesn't matter, whether we're talking about a herbicide or cultural practices or a mechanical practice, we will see weeds adapting to whatever we do throw at them.
But the plan starts with cultural practices, though. That's your point.
It does, and using good agronomic practices is the first place that we need to start. Selecting competitive crops and a diverse rotation of crops. It changes the growing season. It allows us to use different herbicides. I oftentimes say that crop rotation is our most powerful weed management method that we have. Again, it gives us so much more opportunity to manage our weeds through time by having a good, diverse, and even an intense cropping system in place.
A lot of play has been given to cover crops in recent years.
Absolutely, and we might plant cover crops for a variety of reasons, okay, but certainly weed management, weed suppression is one of those reasons that we might use a cover crop, and it's probably going to be more effective on some weeds than on other weeds. For example, I think cover crops are highly effective. A good fall-planted cover crop that establishes in the fall is highly effective at suppressing and almost totally controlling mare's tail in many cases. I wouldn't rate it quite that high on the pigweeds, however. And it's going to vary depending upon, again, when we get that cover crop established. It will vary depending upon how much biomass we produce in the spring, when it warms up, what our precipitation patterns are, and all of that. But certainly we've seen that it can reduce and especially delay the germination and emergence of the pigweeds. It's, again, not going to be standalone by any means in managing pigweeds, but it can be part of that program.
One important point here: cultural, mechanical, whatever methods producer employs as part of this integrated control approach, this does not preclude herbicide use, nor does it suggest, you say, that herbicide use be reduced.
That's absolutely true. And certainly, when we talk about integrated weed management, herbicides are still an important method of control for most producers. And so it would be part of the program. And you're absolutely right that it actually may not reduce your total herbicide usage that much. But it's again, we want to manage our weeds. In some cases, we haven't been successfully doing that. So well-timed herbicides, proper use of herbicides, doing them at the right time. We encourage the use of multiple effective sites of action, especially as we've developed resistance to the different classes or different sites of action. Soil-applied residual herbicides seem to be a very important component of helping to manage our weeds through time, and using them perhaps in a sequential program so that we have overlapping residual. Starting off with maybe residual early in the season, part of your residual program early in the season to hopefully ensure that we get activating rainfall to help that work. And then adding the rest of your residual program at or shortly after planting to extend that residual control later into the season. Once we get the canopy development, usually we're pretty home free from a weed management standpoint. So it's a matter of getting to that point in time. And again, not placing too much pressure on your post-emergence herbicide program for total control. That's what's kind of gotten us into trouble. We need to change that mindset from what we were doing, say, 10 years ago.
Well, all of these principles of integrated pigweed control are covered fully in the new publication from K-State and Dallas. It's readily available to any producer who'd like to get into more depth on this.
Right. This is an online electronic publication only. That's kind of the way we're going these days. So if you're interested in that, I think a simple search will bring that up for you. And it's there for you to digest. Not everything is necessarily going to apply maybe to your situation, but it gives you a lot of things to think about.
The easiest way to find it is to search for K-State Integrated Pigweed Management, and that publication will pop right up. It gives some good guidance on going about pigweed control in the manners we're talking about today. Dallas, many thanks.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Dallas Peterson, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension with us. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we will be back with more in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now, and another glance for you at the Kansas winter wheat crop, and a condition that is all too prevalent in fields out there this year, largely because of our overly wet weather, and that is head blight in wheat as harvest time nears. Joining us once more, wheat disease specialist Erick DeWolf of K-State Research and Extension, who has been out on the road at quite a few, to say the least, wheat plot tours put on by K-State over the past 5 weeks, so he's had a direct look at what's going on out there. When we talk about head blight disease, or head scab as it's known otherwise, it's a concerning thing at harvest. What's the magnitude of the problem right now as you see it, Erick?
Well, we're still starting to get a full picture of what's going to happen here. But as we've been out doing these plot tours in many areas of central Kansas, even eastern Kansas, look like conditions were ideal. Weather conditions were ideal for the development of Fusarium head blight back in May. So this is something that was set in motion a long time ago, and now we're just starting to see the full manifestation of the issue. Some of the susceptible varieties and some of the variety demonstration plots or research plots that I've been in the last month or so look like they're approaching 20% incidence or even higher in some of the more susceptible locations. So we are set up for some potential complications with head scab or Fusarium head blight this year.
It's not unusual to see head scab in the southeastern part of the state. That seems to be a recurring condition in that part of Kansas. But it's occurring in places where it just hasn't been that intense in the past. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct. So historically, we have had problems in Northeast and the East Central and Southeast. More recently, it has had chronic problems with this particular disease. As we move into central Kansas, the outbreaks of this disease are much less common. So we may see problems with Fusarium head blight this year in parts of the south central area and then extending north into the central and even portions of north central Kansas may be affected this year.
What is the issue with head blight in wheat? Well, it has to do with the quality of the end product by and large.
It does. So unlike many of the leaf diseases, we talk a lot in this program about stripe rust or leaf rust or tan spot. Those diseases are primarily limited to the leaves, and they limit the overall productivity of the crop just through stealing resources away or destroying the infrastructure of the leaves that will go and produce that yield that we want to harvest. In this case, the Fusarium head blight is affecting the developing grain directly and can also produce a toxin called a mycotoxin that can further complicate the grain harvest and the marketing of that grain ultimately.
And just in case Eric, a producer, is not sure of the visible evidence of head blight, what does it look like?
So Fusarium head blight is going to cause premature senescence of portions of the head is kind of the visible manifestation of that at this point. So look for portions of the head, maybe an individual spikelet initially, sometimes extending as that lesion continues to spread within the head. Many times we'll see half or three-quarters of the head ultimately succumbs to this particular disease. You can also bend the head to the side and look at the central stem called the rachis that holds the stem all together. Oftentimes it has kind of a chocolatey brown discoloration. And sometimes you can actually see signs of the fungus reproducing there and causing kind of an orange spore structure right along the edges of the glooms. If you open up the flora itself and look at the developing kernel, many times you'll see a white, chalky kernel rather than a normal, healthy green during the late milk stages. Or as it approaches harvest, of course, it's going to become that kind of amber color for a healthy grain. But in this case, you'll see small, shriveled, white and chalky appearance kernels.
And those symptoms should be evident now, even though the crop is somewhat slow in the development by the normal calendar?
Well, the visual symptoms on the heads themselves in the field are most evident at the late milk and doe stages of development. Once the crop begins to senesce or naturally mature, it's much more difficult to identify, just looking at the heads, what's really going on there. Many times producers don't realize they have a problem with it until they start harvesting their grain, and then you'll see these white chalky kernels showing up in the hopper of the combine, and people start asking questions then about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So here we are with harvest time almost here for some parts of Kansas, maybe a couple of weeks ahead for other parts. Nothing that can be done in a preventative sense against this condition at this point.
Right. And unfortunately, there isn't anything that can be done in a preventative sense at this point. Like we said at the introductory comments here, this is something that was set in motion back in May. So the infection takes place right around the flowering or early stages of grain development. And that would have been the time to have fungicides in place to try and suppress the development of disease. So at this point, we're shifting over to making the best of an otherwise difficult situation.
And that means, you say, harvest practices that may make the best out of the end product, as good as one can anyway.
I think so. So in many ways, what we're looking at here is setting harvest priorities. So if we know we have varieties such as Everest or Zenda that have some of the best available genetic resistance, those fields may be better. And I would suggest taking those as a top harvest priority, trying to avoid any additional weathering of that crop to preserve the test weight and quality of fields that are less likely or less at risk to Fusarium head blight.
Can one do something at the harvest point itself, though? That is, adjust the combine to maybe sort the better wheat in a lot that otherwise might be loaded up with blight?
Well, I think that's probably the second thing that we would try. In fields that we know are damaged by Fusarium head blight, there is a small amount of adjustment that we can do. There of course, are limits to what we can do on site with the combine, but the goal here is to try and remove as many of those low test weight shriveled kernels that are visually going to deteriorate or could result in dockages when the grain is marketed, or also carry the vast majority of the fungal toxins that are cause for concern as well. So anything you can do on site with the combine to turn up the airflow and try and blow a lot of those scabby kernels out of the back of the combine will improve your test weight and improve your chances of navigating through the complications of delivering these loads of grain.
And if one has available on-farm storage, you say they might think about segregating that blight-ridden wheat and making a decision on what to do with it at a later time.
Well, I think so. So there's we've talked about harvest priorities. We've talked about trying to do the best you can of cleaning that grain with the combine during harvest. But I think the third option here is where on-farm storage is an option to try and segregate those damaged loads. And certainly don't commingle or mix things that are better quality wheat with damaged wheat. But if you find yourself feeling frustrated that you're getting unacceptable levels of dockage or trying to find the best option to market otherwise damaged grain, I think just taking a little bit of time to let things settle down and put that grain into storage can buy ourselves some time to make some good decisions here. So lots of times in previous outbreaks of this disease, we've seen the most severe dockages and other problems, price discounts occurring right during harvest. But as the season goes on, give the elevators and grain marketers time to figure out what they've got to work with for a local crop and do some sourcing themselves. And then many times they're able to take that grain later, potentially at a smaller discount.
Also, if one, Eric, is inclined toward using that wheat as a feed wheat as opposed to running it through marketing channels, taking the dockage, they might be able to do so, but they, at minimum, need to have it tested for toxins. Yes,
we are very concerned about when we talk about using this wheat as animal feed, we want to be sure we know what we're feeding out. So one of the concerns would be if you take wheat down that route, that it could have mycotoxins in it. The primary one in this case is sometimes called vomitoxin, and it is particularly a problem for monogastric animals. So we often think about swine or pigs being particularly sensitive to this, and I would avoid feeding this kind of wheat to those animals for sure. Ruminant animals, probably the more robust, larger animals are going to be more tolerant of this. Still, with that said, we probably only want to have this potentially damaged wheat be a small portion of their ration.
And blend it down, dilute it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Blend it down with some other healthy feedstuffs, and it may be able to find a use for this grain after all.
But once more, there's nothing you can do to amend the situation at this point. You'll just have to figure out if, in fact, Fusarium head blight has taken up residence in your soon-to-be harvested wheat. Think about how you'll manage that wheat from harvesting and then afterward, and come up with a strategy that'll maximize the situation to your benefit. Well, the next time we visit, we possibly will be talking about what you'll be up to in the coming weeks. You'll be gathering notes on disease issues in this wheat crop and eventually with a disease loss estimate at some point.
Yeah, we will certainly be working with the Kansas Department of Agriculture over the next few weeks to try and summarize all our disease observations for the year. You know, the headliners look like they're going to be stripe rust, leaf rust, and, of course, head scab or Fusarium head blight that we've been talking about so much in this segment.
All right. And looking forward to that analysis and what it tells us about variety selection as we move forward into the next growing season. But not to get ahead of ourselves, this is the concern at hand right now. That is Fusarium head blight in winter wheat in Kansas. Far more well distributed in the state than it is normally. Eric, we appreciate the update. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Erick DeWolf, with us on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Erick Atkinson back with you, and now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, headway was made this past week in row crop planting toward the final planting acreage, hopefully, according to the update from the USDA and the Agricultural Statistics Service for the week ending this past Sunday. Our topsoil moisture in the state at 18% surplus, 80% adequate, only 2% very short to short, and subsoil moisture at 21% surplus and 77% adequate, again, only 2% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop at 58% good to excellent, 29% fair, 13% poor to very poor. Winter wheat now colored at 79%, that's behind the average for the date, and wheat mature now at 21%. Harvest is 1% complete, that's behind the 12% average for the date. Now, the condition of the Kansas corn crop this week, 47% good to excellent, 39% fair, and 14% poor to very poor. Corn planting is at 96%. That's very near the average. And emergence at 83%, still behind the 96% average there. Soybean plantings, 74% complete now. The average is 82% for the date. Emergence of that crop, 45%. That's well behind the 65% average. And grain sorghum planting at 55% now. That's behind the 71% average. Range and pasture conditions this week are rated at 76% good to excellent, 21% fair, and 3% poor to very poor. For a look at the national scope on crop productivity and planting, we hear now from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says rain has caused delays in development of major crops.
Progress, for the most part, remains at a record slow pace for both planting and emergence for corn and soybeans.
For corn,
for the week ending June 16th, 92% of that crop planted by the 16th. Of course, the 5-year average is 100%. Last year, 100%.
He says this year's 92% is a record low.
There's only a handful of years where we didn't see planting complete at this point. The most recent was 2013, but even that year, 99% complete by June 16th.
Corn condition is steady from last week at 59% good to excellent and 10% very poor to poor. Meanwhile, with soybeans,
that's actually one that's not quite a record, but still very slow. 77% of the U.S. soybeans planted by June 16th. 5-year average 93%. Last year, 96%.
Rippey says winter wheat harvesting is getting underway in the South.
And even now the Midwest in between rainstorms. But overall, just 8% of the 2019 winter wheat crop has been harvested. That compares to the 5-year average of 20% and last year's 25%.
He says there are significant delays in states like Oklahoma, Illinois, and Missouri. Nationwide, winter wheat condition is better than last year.
64% good to excellent. 9% very poor to poor. That compares favorably to last year's crop, which had drought problems on the southern plains.
Meanwhile, he zeroes in on soft red winter wheat states.
We do have some serious problems related to winter kill and wetness. And so, for example, Ohio winter wheat is 31% rated very poor to poor, which is tops in the nation in those categories.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
On the trade front, the U.S. has suspended a dispute panel which was established to rule on the U.S. challenge of China's intellectual property practices until December the 31st. That issue is at the heart of the trade dispute between the two countries that began following the Section 301 investigation by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative that took issue with Chinese practices, including forced technology transfer and IP theft. Following the investigation, the U.S. imposed new tariffs on imports of certain Chinese goods and initiated the dispute proceedings at the WTO in March of last year. The dispute panel was established last November. The U.S. gave no reason for the suspension. Meanwhile, the WTO announced that it has suspended the dispute over China's economic status based on a request from China. China had brought the challenge at the WTO against the European Union stance that China was not a market economy. China is said to have lost that case at the WTO, but the final ruling has not yet been made public. Some speculate the action by China could be a bid by that country to avoid the release of the decision. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning what we're doing about heat abatement. You know, with the spring weather that we've had, I imagine a lot of things have kind of gotten lost in the mix as we've tried to get forages harvested and corn and other crops into the ground. So, question I have for you today as we move forward into summer, we are going to experience heat stress, and more than likely, on average, probably a lot here in Kansas. So how are the cooling systems on your farms, and are they ready for the summertime? Have you cleaned the fans yet? You know that airflow through the fans can be reduced by up to 30% because of the accumulation of dust and debris on the blades and on the shrouds around the fans. So cleaning them is very, very important. I know you got a lot of things to do and maybe not enough hours in the day to do it, but if you haven't assigned that job to someone on the farm, it's probably something that should get done. Secondly, you need to just check the systems, make sure that they're actually working correctly. Remember, we'd like to see fans come on probably at about 65 degrees, and the soaker systems over the feed lines, if you have those, should be implemented to start at 68 to 70 degrees. So you need to make sure that all of those systems are up and ready. We haven't had severe heat stress yet, but it's probably not too far around the corner, so time to get those things checked out. So how do we put priority on which systems we should work on first? Well, the first system I would work on would be your holding pin cooling. Again, making sure the fans are operational and making sure that our soaker systems in that area are ready for the summer heat. This is where the cows will first experience heat stress on your dairy, so it's important that you have these systems ready and to go before we start worrying about other systems. Second place I would work would be wherever the cow housing is. So what would be the priority there? Well, that's kind of a difficult thing to say, but maybe you might want to think about it this way. Where do the cows spend most of their day? Well, they spend more of their day in their beds than any other place, hopefully. So having the fans over the bed operational is very important. I would move next to the feed line where we've got our soaking systems, making sure that we've got fans running, as well as the soaking system ready for the summertime heat. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to get ready for the summer heat so that we can keep our cows as comfortable as possible.
Thanks, Mike. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This Agriculture Today comes to a close now with our weekly wildlife management segment, and alongside is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Focus this time, Charlie, is on woodland management for wildlife. Yes, we have trees in Kansas, and yes, there is a tight relationship between those woodlands and several wildlife species.
Yes, wildlife is certainly a major part of the enjoyment of Kansas woodlands. Woodlands are lands that are typically thought of as being naturally covered with trees and shrubs. Some folks would include those areas of forested land that have been planted, but we would include both types, both planted and naturally occurring trees and shrub areas. Woodland wildlife would include squirrels and deer and turkey and songbirds. All of those species are going to benefit from good woodland management. We've talked many times about grassland management, but woodland management has its own set of techniques that can be used to improve woodland products as well as wildlife that enjoy woodlands.
What constitutes good woodland management? It sounds like a daunting task, but you say there are a number of things that individuals can fairly handily achieve here.
Yeah, the woodland management is not really complex as most wildlife management plans develop. They must first start with a plan. Develop your landowner objectives, do an inventory of the resources you have, try to match up the resources you have with what is practical, and then develop the techniques to put your plan into place. We usually start with looking at timber harvest. Many areas that are woodlands need some clearings. We can take out the high-value trees, market those trees. Sometimes those funds can then be used to help do other management techniques that are important. I think when you're harvesting timber, it's important to leave some den trees. Those would be trees that have natural cavities. I like to see some standing dead trees left and trees that provide some food value. Oftentimes what I see in hand-planted woodlands is not enough diversity. We see perhaps only trees that are designed to have a future market, but typically to make good woodland wildlife habitat, you need not only the cavities for shelter, whether that is big holes or some standing dead trees. You also need food trees, and then those trees that are fully mature to provide shade and reduce some of the sunlight that penetrates to the soil surface. Now, when we talk about a closed canopy, that's not exactly what many people desire because it limits the number of wildlife species that may be utilizing that area. So oftentimes timber harvest is used to thin out some of the area and open that ground level up to sunlight penetration where you can get regeneration of new forbs and young trees to begin to grow.
So timber harvest is the starting point and a good base from which to work, but you say also one needs to think in terms of timber stand improvement aligned with that.
And some of that can be done at the same time, but typically when we talk about timber stand improvement, it's not always just removing everything that's of not high value. It may require leaving some of those standing dead trees, removing some of the poorer quality, low-value trees, perhaps by girdling them and leaving them stand so that they turn into those cavity trees, by perhaps not chemically treating the stumps so that those would then sprout out and provide beneficial browse and low-level cover. Perhaps it would be leaving some of the grapevines and Virginia creeper vines or even poison ivy vines that are in place. They typically cause little damage and may even be beneficial to some of the trees. Sometimes you can use some of those thinnings and place those into brush piles. I'm personally not a real big fan of brush piles, but I do think that we can do some things by half-cutting some trees so that their tops or branches touch the ground. Then they would still maintain and continue to live, but then become covered with vines. I think that seems to work better than just making brush piles. And I think as we think about this timber stand improvement, it's important to remember we need to maintain some buffer strips along the stream and creek channels. As wet as it's been this spring and some of the large amounts of water flow that we've had, those folks that have property along streams realize that they're dynamic. There's a lot of change that takes place when these big floods come through, and woodlands do a great job of buffering that, slowing down some of that erosion, and allowing soil to be deposited on the stream banks rather than entering the stream channel.
Well, how about introducing new plantings into a woodland, that is actually establishing new trees and understory?
Well, you can plant new species. Typically, woodland management includes planting some food-producing trees like oaks or pecans, hickory. Those are some species that do a good job with providing food value that's missing in some of our natural plantings. So I don't see a lot of new plantings within existing woodlands, but new plantings alongside of streams in cropland or in grassland areas The buffer edge of streams and creeks provide the edge effect, the diversity that's so important, and we need to feather those out, not have an abrupt change from tall, mature woodlands to cropland, but go in more of a gradual state where perhaps we go from mature trees to trees that are 10 to 15 years of age and then to some shrubs, and perhaps the buffer area then would be grassland. That would probably maximize the number of wildlife species that are going to use the area and certainly increase the property for personal enjoyment.
And lastly, you say protecting those woodlands from adverse conditions, primarily grazing and wildfire.
Well, livestock should be eliminated from new tree plantings and then closely monitored and perhaps removed from mature woodlands. Particularly wintering cows in woodlands doesn't do a lot for woodland management. And then try and protect some of those areas from fire. Many times that fire is going to damage the base of some of the more mature trees and then introduce decay and rot into those.
Well, those are the key elements to woodland management in support of wildlife species. Charlie, thanks for the look at this today. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee there. With that, our Tuesday edition comes to a close. Thanks for tuning in. Erick Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.